Okay, today my guest is Professor Andrew Delios. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Andrew as a person, and Professor Delios is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar. And then finally, as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Andrew is a fellow of the Academy of International Business, and he has served as an editor-in-chief, senior editor, or area editor of the Journal of Management Studies, Asia Pacific Journal of Management, and the Canadian Journal of Administrative Sciences. Andrew is the past president of the Asia Academy of Management, and his research looks at strategy, governance, and competition in emerging economies, with particular attention on the Japanese and publicly listed companies in China. Thank you, Andrew, for your time and for joining.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity.
So first, what did you want to become when you were a child?
That's always a difficult question in the sense that we have to, of course, recall who we were as children. But for me, it was actually very challenging to imagine what I wanted to be. I could never settle on anything in particular. The only things I knew is that I was intrigued by possibilities of what could be in the world. So as a heavy reader of science fiction, for example, and I always wanted to maintain one parameter for any profession that I had, which was maintain as much freedom as I could for myself, both in terms of mobility, in terms of thought, in terms of schedule, and so forth. And it took me a long time to realize that an academic was actually the profession that suited those broad parameters. So I never had any visions of one profession or another, but I had ideas of what kind of life I would like to live. Yes.
Interesting. So can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between domestic versus foreign?
That was always a part of my life. My parents were immigrants to Canada. My father spoke 5 languages, only one of which was English, of course. He grew up in Egypt. He migrated to England when he was 30 years old, but he was actually a Greek national. And you know, we came to Canada when I was young, and even in my neighborhood around me, there were visibly different ethnically families. So you know, international was always a part of our life. And even though I grew up in a very in the heart of North America, it's still those tangible aspects of seeing things different, which constitute the world of international, were there as formative elements, I think, of my young life.
Interesting. How or when did you choose to be an IB scholar to formalize this experience?
That wasn't until I was about 28 years old. So as I mentioned, I had ideas about what I wanted to have in my life as an adult, both professionally and personally, but I didn't know what profession would yield that. As I went through school, I graduated with my undergraduate degree in economics and geography. And then as much out of chance as anything else, I studied for an MBA, and I discovered, hey, actually business studies is pretty interesting. But when I graduated my MBA degree, I then took the unusual step of becoming an English teacher in a rural town in Japan. And one reason I did this was simply a bad year to graduate, which I'm sure many of our students are experiencing in the COVID-19 in the current situation. But sometimes chance yields positive rewards. So when I went to Japan, I discovered, hey, I kind of like this idea of teaching. So I spent 2 years there, and at the end of 2 years in Japan, where I studied Japanese intensively, I tried to embed myself in the culture as much as possible. And indeed, I had no choice because I was one of only 2 foreigners living in the town in which I lived. So, necessarily I had to embrace all that was Japanese around me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to survive for those 2 years. But at the conclusion of those 2 years, I decided that maybe first of all, I had to return to Canada. Otherwise, I would have remained in Japan for the rest of my life because I would have become so embedded in local culture. But then when I returned to Canada, I spent a year contemplating my options, and I visited some of the professors who had taught me during my MBA program. And I explained to them my situation, and they gently encouraged me to pursue a PhD. And eventually I applied to several schools and ended up at the Ivey Business School at University of Western Ontario. And from the moment I stepped foot into into their buildings, I realized that this was exactly the profession for me. Not only had I had exposure to teaching and discovered that, hey, this wasn't too bad, but then as soon as I had exposure to research, I thought, wow, this is wonderful. This is exactly what I want in my life, a way to learn things, to exercise thinking, to present ideas, to debate with people, and to maintain my freedom as much as possible.
Interesting. Well, I normally ask, what's something that on your CV, something unique about yourself? Well, you gave a lot of things so far. So anything besides these, something that is not many people would know about you.
Yeah, I mean, there are many different things. I've done a huge number of different jobs, most of them with my hands. I've worked as a lineman for the CP Rail in Canada. I've worked for a small business in a service station, so I know how to repair vehicles, minor repairs of vehicles. I've worked as a cashier. My very first job in my life, or second job in my life, was shining shoes at a golf course, which I did so that I was able to play golf. Yeah, so I've done a huge number of jobs. What people might or might not know about me is that I absolutely love sports, both as a spectator and a participant in sports. So I played ice hockey for at least 45 years of my life. I'm an avid golfer. And one of my aspirations when I was in my 40s was to get my handicap down to scratch or zero, which I managed to do for a couple of weeks, which I consider to be one of my main sporting achievements. Not an easy thing to do. So I think we all have very rich lives outside of academics. And when you ask that question, I'm sure there's lots of things we could explore about any of us. But those are just a few
things. Super interesting to me. Thank you. So let's talk about regrets. What is the one thing you wish you would have done that you didn't?
That's a question I sometimes ask myself, but I never answer, because we can't live our life with the benefit of hindsight. I could say, yes, I've made this mistake in my life. I made that mistake in my life. I've made investments that have lost me $250,000 that I could say, yes, that's a regret. But at the end of the day, you know, I thought it was the best decision that I made at that particular time. I've had events in my personal life that were not as good as what they could have been. So, you know, is that a regret? Maybe it is. I could have spent more time with family members, particularly my parents, which could be a regret. But again, that's not necessarily a regret. It's just a reality of the choices we make. And if I'm happy with where my life is in the present day, then I can't say I have regrets about any real aspects. Sure. Maybe if I wanted to be one work specific regret, is that when I was an editor of the Journal of Management Studies, I still remember one paper where I made a mistake as an editor, where the paper was rejected because of my bad communication or poor communication to the authors. And in the end, that paper was not published where it should have been published. So professionally, that's actually a fairly big regret, because I recognize how important papers are to one's career trajectory. So maybe that's not a grand regret in the larger scheme of things, but it is something that still troubles me personally.
How about market corrects itself? I mean, if the journal didn't publish it, if the paper is good, obviously it's going to find a different house. So hopefully it turned out fine for that paper eventually.
Hopefully so, but still I did not fulfill my duties as an editor. And that's something that we have to be cognizant of, our professional responsibilities, and making sure we fulfill those, particularly when we have positions of responsibility.
Right. What are you most passionate about?
These days, I think I'm most passionate about building our programs at the National University of Singapore. Within the classroom, we have individual agency to work with our students in the context of that particular module. But now that I've become the Vice Dean of MSc Programs, I see substantial more opportunity to shape the educational experience of students and to position the programs in unique ways that can, of course, contribute to those programs and to those experiences of those students. So I invest a lot of my time in the programs in the present day. Just as examples, I interviewed 350 students for admissions over the past 8 months. Each conversation constituted 30 to 45 minutes because I felt it really important to understand who we'd be admitting to the program. Now, I'm not going to do that each and every year, but I believe that for me to do my job properly, I had to understand who are the applicants to the program and what they could bring to the program. And once I understood that, I could better guide our team in terms of what to look for during the interview process. As part of the process of building the programs, we have to make a lot of hard decisions about what constitutes appropriate and inappropriate behavior, and what are our responsibilities to the students, and what are the students' responsibilities to us. So we have a lot of time, we spend a lot of time, given that it's still a fairly new set of programs, defining those parameters and shaping what is our program. So I find that, yeah, there's tremendous opportunity for us to develop the program. The consequence has been that we've actually doubled the number of our students, but again, MSc is a growth area, and I know a number of schools have done that, but we did double the number of students and double our revenues from year over year during COVID-19. So I'm very proud of that achievement, because we were able to maintain our focus on our overall mission, even though COVID-19 presented some difficulties in the fulfillment of that mission or objective.
And congratulations for this dedication, and it obviously helps the rankings of the school as well. I mean, this is not a small task. This is a big.
I mean, yeah. At the end of the day, there's so many pieces that can contribute to the rankings, but at the end, we also have to think. Those rankings are reflective of the processes we put in place and the educational experience. And given the costs that students incur to study MSCs, both opportunity and financial, we have a heavy responsibility to deliver well on those programs.
Now let's talk about research. Imagine you are stranded in a small village and you sought refuge in a small neighborhood pub, and the locals are curious about who you are, what you do for a living, and you're supposed to explain what you do to this type of an audience, not an academic audience, but a layman. In your own words, in short, what do you do?
I do a lot of thinking. I do a lot of writing. I think that's the easiest way to do it. Sometimes not enough thinking, and sometimes too much writing. So in short, what I would explain to people is we try to understand how people relate to each other in organizations and how organizations connect to each other. If we were sitting in a pub, I'd say, hey, you're in this pub. The pub next door is right beside you. Why did you choose to come to this pub instead of that pub? What is it like to speak to the people in this pub instead of that pub? How do the owners behave to you? How do you make your choice of the particular beer you drink? So I would explain it in those kinds of terms. So I wouldn't really necessarily describe in terms of international business, because that would be too much out of context. But I would try to explain issues of competition, organization, and relationships between organizations.
I mean, Andrew, you had a very long career, and I'm curious what your take on is for the omitted variables, that the things that we're not studying in IB.
There's many. I mean, this can be a very, very big topic about the things that we study and don't study in IB, and whether it's omitted variable bias or endogeneity or whatever. I think we have a long way to go to consider what we do as academic scholars. There's been tremendous work done by a large number of people in terms of defining what we need to do empirically to better represent the phenomena we choose to study. And we'll be running a special issue with the journal World Business on advances in empirical methods. I think the call is out now, and we're accepting papers in the second quarter of the coming year of 2021 that looks to explore some of those issues more deeply. So at one level, we can say we have a standard set of methods, and we need to improve those methods, and therefore we correct something such as omitted variables bias. At another level, we can actually step back and say, look, this has been the pathways that all of us have taken to learn about empirical methods. Is that pathway actually correct, or do we need to chart an alternative pathway? And that's the thing I'd like ourselves, that's what I would like us to ask ourselves, is actually the core paradigm of empirical work not sustainable, but correct for the type of investigations we want to make. Because the reality is that people do not place enough faith in empirical findings to actually make decisions in organizations as contingent upon what we find empirically. Right? So for example, we've been studying internationalization and performance for a long period of time. We should be able to have tangible facts or numbers or data to report to people who manage organizations that can suggest to them, what's going to happen if you make this decision. Now, we can't say exactly what will happen, but what are the chances of something happening? What is a point estimate? What is our error what's the range of error around that estimate? If we invest in this, if we make this decision, maybe we can augment profitability by 2% plus or minus 3% or something along those lines, right? So we have to be more acute. And I'm not describing it very well, but we have to, I think, generate evidence that's more useful for decision making as one part of our empirical work. This is very consistent what's done, I think, in a lot of policy research and elsewhere. One of the things we'll be working on, hopefully, is a review paper on corruption. And what we want to shift in this review paper are ideas that when we look at corruption, we've established certain kinds of associations. Yes, in most environments, more corruption or more regulation leads to lower levels of investment and lower economic performance. Wonderful, but that's not surprising to anybody. Now, can we think of it more in terms of interventionist activities as Ivey scholars to say, hey, look, given that we have this level of petty corruption, what if we take this kind of intervention in the economy? So for example, we create a website or some kinds of means, which they actually did in Indonesia, to report petty levels of corruption. Will this actually change those petty levels of corruption? In other words, if we shine light, which people have talked about, but we've never really tested. Now, this is done in the political science literature where they do a lot of experiments or interventions, and they actually check to see, they inform theory, but at the same time, they also inform practice and start to help people deal with some of these issues that have been around for a long period of time. So I think more so than an admitted variable bias, there's a lot more opportunities for us to inform the phenomena that we investigate and hopefully help people deal with issues that have been troubling them with many years. Indeed, when you talk about one of my frustrations is that is what I look about in the world around me in Southeast Asia. And again, this issue of corruption, it hasn't moved in most of the countries in 2.5 decades that I've been living out here. This is tragic. That means a whole generation has passed by who are still dealing with the same petty and grand corruption issues that their parents dealt with, or even their grandparents dealt with. This is just wrong. Because we know about this topic, but we just don't help people address it. And when we really, really begin to look at corruption and how pernicious it is and how deeply rooted it is in society and how it affects people's lives in so many different levels, this is just a tremendous oversight on our part. So I began this part of the discussion by saying, yes, we need to be slightly more acute in terms of generating information, tangible empirical estimates that can help inform decision making. And then I suggested, one of those examples is for example, our treatment of corruption, either from the generation side, like why it exists in the economy, or from the other side of it would be how managers need to deal with it, because that's a very, very challenging issue for them. Ultimately, though, if we're going to do this, we need to ask ourselves, do we as research feel so confident about our empirical findings, and not just associational research? In other words, X influences, we have some influence, positive or negative, between two variables, but actually we can, do better estimates of effect size. Are we willing to deconstruct our methods to the point where we can be more confident about predicting effect sizes? Now, why I say we have to construct a new pathway is because our current systems of doing research do not reward people well enough for making those heavy investments on super precise empirical research. Because even we publish and create super precise empirical research, most people believe at the end of the day, a well-intentioned, and I seriously mean this, well-intentioned reviewer or editor will turn around and say, yeah, but the conceptual contribution is too weak. So I think we need to recast some of our visions of what constitutes good research. And sometimes good research can be primarily empirical. Now, I know SMJ has tried to plant this flag in the ground, and they're a bit of a lone flag bearer, but I think us be AIB fellows, be other people who can help decide direction of some of these decisions. Maybe need to sit down one day and say, look, maybe JIBS has a space for really, really precise, deeply interesting empirical articles where clearly someone has vested a year in their life in generating data, in really, really good data, and analyzing it appropriately, and we'll publish it. We will publish it. I don't care about the conceptual contribution. Ask a really, really good question, generate that data, show us that you've invested in that data, not just downloaded a couple of databases from some kind of archival website, and show us, that you've actually really thought about the issues, and maybe that can be sufficient to publish a paper. If we can establish those guidelines and legitimize that kind of research, then hopefully we'll see people begin to engage in that kind of research instead of doing what's happening more often now, which is, large database research, and then hoping that, the association you find will have some kind of conceptual intrigue to it that will lead to its publication.
I mean, in this segment, you mentioned a couple of super important things. And one of them is quality empirical work, contribution to theory building, theory testing, and bringing out the implications, informing the practice, building on the, what's the takeaway for the society? What's the takeaway for the people, actual managers, right? I mean, you just brought up a lot of things. So our flagship journal, JIBS, we've got the policy journal now. Do we have enough, or do we need a new one for more precise empirical work, like you said, more data work? Or what's the solution for these items that you identified?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different steps that one would need to take. So certainly the Academy has tried to address it through expanding its suite of journals. And definitely if the Journal of International, the AIB did this by creating a separate journal, maybe published twice per year, that would be a very, very strong signal about this importance. So that would definitely be one step. Then the second step would actually be sitting down and thinking about what constitutes appropriate quality standards so that we could communicate this to the relevant audiences. Of course, there would be an element of top down, then an element of bottom up as we begin to see what those papers are, and they would help to define as well what is an appropriate standard for this kind of research. But I think this should be a very deliberate kind of act taken, perhaps by the formation of the journal, but also by the creation of these particular standards by the editors who would be supervising that journal, but also as having broader oversight by our community, and not only oversight, but also input from our community, so that it would have that legitimacy. And ultimately, hopefully, our institutions would recognize these as valid publications for evaluating the path of one's career, because we can't get away from that aspect.
Andrew, you've seen many PhD students come and go, and you trained many of them. You also read many papers as an editor-in-chief. You made a lot of decisions on these things. What are the top 3 major big mistakes that junior faculty do, or PhD students run into? What are the top 3 major issues?
So the first thing I think the people do is they underestimate the ability of the editor, and perhaps for many of the reviewers, to recognize the motivations and the amount of work that's gone into the research. There's Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, which talks about how people can make nearly instantaneous judgments on work once they've been exposed to a particular area of work, and they've developed expertise in that consequently developed expertise, and hence intuitively can recognize what's happening. I believe for some of our better editors, they can blink a paper. You see a paper, flip, and right away you have an impression. Positive or negative, this is a reality. And why I'm saying this is that authors need to be cognizant of the ability of editors to spot some things very quickly. So when I as an editor or reviewer or as a reader, when I look at a paper, right away I have an impression of, did someone actually take this topic seriously? If they're not taking it seriously, why should I take it seriously? Are they doing research because they feel they need to do that to preserve their career? Are they doing research because they're really, really interested in the topic? This is a conversation I have endlessly with my colleagues at NUS. And one of the reasons I like my department so much is we sit there and we ask the question about, why are we doing the research? What questions do we really want to ask? Yes, we have many accomplished senior colleagues in my department, all of whom have demonstrated abilities to publish. But at the end of the day, we want to be addressing questions that we think are important to others or important to ourselves. We're not just addressing questions for the sake of publishing research. Now, I understand that there is a certain career motivation to everybody where they have to publish the research. Okay, that's fine. But still, invest something in the project other than just skimming the top, covering all the boxes, filling in the template, then sending it out and hoping. Because that's just a futile exercise and a waste of your time. Really, why are we engaged in this profession? Okay, if you feel it's difficult to publish, okay, there's many different outlets for the publications that will accept various kinds of qualities and contributions of work. But the main thing has to be, at least please do something in which you're interested, and don't let that paper have an aura of, man, I'm just doing this because I got to do this work to keep my career. All right. So I feel that's one of the things that I look at with papers. Then next comes the execution. How much of it is driven by data? How much is driven by conceptual contribution? And these are always difficult things to diagnose. And yeah, I mean, there's just so many other elements that one can look at. And then finally, I like to ask myself is, has the author really been self-critical to their work? In other words, if they're doing empirics, have they gotten a satisfactory set of empirical results? But then have they really asked themselves, is this the optimal set of empirical results? Have I tried to kill my empirical results? In other words, through specifications, robustness tests, whatever we like to say, have I actually gone to the effort to convince myself that this is the best empirical results? Or am I just trusting or hoping that the reviewers or editors have slightly less quantitative acumen than me, and hence they're not going to see whatever errors might exist in my work? So again, that relates back to the bigger picture. Are they really vested in their research, or does this just become a tool by which they can move forward in their careers? Now, I also recognize that we have scholars of all different types of abilities, and we have all different types of research questions. And we have to also be cognizant of that, because ultimately, again, we're also dealing with people in their careers. So one of my most satisfactory areas of work in the present day are working with many of our young scholars who are trying to take those next steps in advancing their research. So I have what I consider my own core research interests, where I tend to lead projects. And then I have other sets of research where I tend to follow projects. And I just don't want to be like a bottom third name on the paper, but I want to contribute substantively in ways that help my colleagues understand the research process and develop their skills. And sometimes, maybe I'm not completely interested in the research question that's in these papers, and I'll even tell my co-authors that. But what I am interested is in two things. Number one, the integrity of the process. In other words, maximizing the value of that paper, given its research question and its data, if it has data. And then number two, somehow working with that person so that they can also advance their career. And I find this to be extremely important. So maybe the paper looks, if published, looks a bit of an outlier on my CV, but I don't really care about that. What I care about is that we've taken something, we've maxed its potential, and hopefully the person with whom I'm working has further developed their skills in the process. And then a third positive offshoot would be, after we've battled with the review process for a couple of years together to get the paper published, hopefully we're also still friends and good colleagues, because there's lots of tension that can arise during the publication process. Yeah.
It takes 4 years. So
Yes.
Let me summarize. 1, ask questions that matter. 2, use methods that stand on their own or scrutiny. And 3, integrity of the research process. This was very helpful. Thank you. Now, for the sake of time, my last question. What is one question that I should have asked you but didn't?
That's an interesting question. So one question you could have asked me, you could have asked me about my sons. They're two brilliant young boys who are just turning 20 and 18 years old. The oldest boy, he's studying at Princeton University. He's doing a business economics undergraduate degree. His life, as anybody else, has been struck hard by COVID-19. So he spent the first semester and half of his life in New Jersey. And then he had to come back in March last year, and he hasn't been allowed back on campus for his second semester. So he'll go back for his junior year. And yeah, he's an interesting guy. We share a lot of responsibilities. And one of the best decisions I ever made in my life was when he was 10 years old and his brother was 8 years old. I stopped much of my traveling, and I spent a lot of time with them. And as a consequence, we have a fairly close tie to each other. And both of them share a lot of information with me and feel very comfortable being in the same house with me, which is not always the same situation for a lot of teenage boys, particularly with their parents. So I'd say that, if you ask me a question about what was one of the best decisions of my life, maybe I can rephrase it to get to where you were. I would say it was to stop a lot of the work, because actually Jay Annan told me this, what Bruce Kogut said to him once. When Jay was who's at Ohio State, who was also at Ivey when I was at Ivey, and he was a really fun guy to hang out with, and he helped me develop a lot of my thinking because he was so intolerant of poor thinking. What he told me is when he was a PhD student, he saw Bruce Kogut go on vacation. And he said, "Bruce, how can you go away? You got so much work to do." And I think he said to Jay, if I remember the story correctly, is, look, that work will always be there. And that's our lives, right? Work will always be there. So that was I took that, I for whatever reason, I remember that. I took that to heart when I was, 10 years ago. And I believe my work will still be there, but my children will be growing up, and those relationships will not always be there unless I invest in them at this particular time. So sure enough, I took some time off work. You can see in my publications that there was a few less publications from 2010 to 2017. But that's a lot of that as a consequence of me just directing my energies elsewhere. And I don't regret that at all, because, I still have another 20 plus years, fingers crossed, in this profession, and that work will always be there. And the best thing is when you return from that, you feel energized and refreshed, as I do now. So even though I'm working these days as hard as I did as a PhD student, and here's another fact that I should mention, is my first 100 days as a PhD student, I didn't take one day off. I didn't even take one day off. I worked endlessly. Even when I did laundry, I brought papers with me to read. But anyway, that's another point. I still energize and work as hard as I do. So finally, to give fair shoot, my youngest son, he's going to go to University of Adelaide, and he's going to study psychological science. And actually now I've got him working on a meta-analysis project. His mother found the project for him with a group of Adelaide researchers. So maybe we have a budding scholar in the family through my youngest boy, whose also name is Andrew. So I'm hoping he'll publish because he has the same name as me. And if he starts publishing, then because we have the exact same name and a very unique name, maybe both our CVs will be conflated and our Google Scholar
is exploding.
Yes, exactly.
Good thinking.
That's the whole idea.
Note to self, change the name of my daughter to something else, my wife's name.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Yes.
Thank you for this candid interview. I learned a lot, and I'm sure many of the viewers are going to feel the same way. Thank you so much for your time and for your participation. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks for creating this initiative, and hope you will enjoy many great interviews through this process. Bye.